One of the things that's unique about stories in ancient mythology, and in particular Greek mythology, is that death and the afterlife are often depicted as places that characters can go in the story, and they can actually visit death. In our world, unless you love horror movies, there is no communication between the living and the dead. So in these ancient mythological stories, when characters are bouncing from the underworld to the afterlife, back to the mortal world, back to the underworld, it all probably seems very strange to us. But it's a great storytelling device because it allows the characters in the story to interact with death in a much more interesting and direct way. So death is not just a abstract concept anymore, or some sort of destination at the end of a long journey. It's now something that the characters must confront right in front of their faces. This will force them to face the things that contribute to death, or the things that lead to death, or the things that people fear. And this adds a new dimension to character development and storytelling. Again, when death is confronted, people must look into their past actions and the things they fear. They must confront evil, all of the things that contribute or lead to death. In the Odyssey, Odysseus is told by Circe that he must go to the prophet Tiresias, make a bunch of sacrifices, and visit this land of death. So Odysseus gets there, he makes the appropriate sacrifices, and he begins to be surrounded by shades, ghosts of the dead from his past. There's an interesting section where Odysseus is describing all these different people who are dead, young and old, male and female, people who were ready to die, people who were not ready to die. And he says, quote, "Now the souls gathered, stirring out of Erebus, brides and young men, and men grown old in pain, and tender girls whose hearts were new to grief. Many were there too, torn by brazen lancets, battle slain, bearing still their bloody gear. From every side they came and sought the pit with rustling cries, and I grew sick with fear." End quote. I like this section because it highlights one of the themes of the Odyssey, which is that death is undefeated, and it's going to include Odysseus eventually, everybody close to him, and how you respond to that fact and deal with it tells us a lot about character. And how you treat others in death also, especially in the ancient Greek world, tells us a lot. A proper burial is important in the ancient world, and it helps the soul move on to the afterlife in many different cultures. And many of the ghosts that Odysseus sees are his own men. So he has to be confronted with the decisions that he made that led to the deaths of the people he cares about. This includes the guy back at Circe's place who fell off the top floor when they were leaving, and he chides Odysseus a little bit for not giving him a proper burial. Odysseus realizes his error and promises to retrieve the body and give him a proper burial. From there, the prophet of death, Tiresias, drinks the blood sacrifice that Odysseus cooked up, and he predicts a little bit of the future and some of the upcoming perils that Odysseus is going to have, and he also warns Odysseus that he probably will have to go someplace other than Ithaca after he kills the suitors. From there, Odysseus has to confront death and some of the people who have died who are most important to him. His mother appears, and this is a really sad scene because this is how Odysseus finds out that she's dead. When he left for the Trojan War all those years ago, his mother was still alive. And of course, Odysseus wants to know how she died and what's been happening in Ithaca. And the mom tells him the story. So it turns out that Odysseus' dad has taken the loss of Odysseus tough, and he's been isolated, working by himself out in the countryside, withdrawing from the world. For her part, she said that she died of loneliness from his absence. Earlier, we mentioned that maybe this world of death represents things that Odysseus fears, and maybe one of these fears was that his mother died of loneliness and grief from his actions. And that is tough for any son to bear. We also have to remember with the Odyssey, really at all times, that this is a post-war story. And the story of Odysseus's mother here connects to this theme of people living in the aftermath of war and tragedy. And we often hear stories and legends of great war heroes, but we don't often hear as much about how war affects the people back home, the people who weren't out fighting, but have to deal with the ramifications of what happened in those wars. Odysseus describes trying to hug his mother, maybe one last time. He says, quote, "Then in my heart I wanted to embrace the spirit of my mother. She was dead, and I did not know how. 3 times I tried, longing to touch her, but 3 times her ghost flew from my arms, like shadows or like dreams. Sharp pain pierced deeper in me as I cried, 'No, mother, why do you not stay for me and let me hold you, even here in Hades? Let us wrap loving arms around each other and find a frigid comfort in shared tears. But is this really you, or has the queen sent me a phantom to increase my grief?'" End quote. The queen there referring to Persephone, queen of the Underworld, but it's an emotional passage. And it reminds us again that death is undefeated, clocks don't go backward, and Odysseus will never get that chance to hug his mother one more time. From there, Odysseus is visited by an all-star lineup of Greek heroes and villains who have all met their ends. Oedipus, Ariadne, Heracles, Heracles' mother, etc. But then Odysseus is shocked to meet his friend Agamemnon, his old battle companion from the Trojan War, who was alive when they both left Troy to go back home after the war. This is where Odysseus finds out what we, the reader, have known for a couple of books now, which is that Agamemnon was plotted against and killed by his wife and her wife's new suitor. I think this part serves as a warning to Odysseus so that he knows, and Agamemnon advises him to arrive in stealth when he gets to Ithaca. Agamemnon says, "Don't immediately reveal yourself because you shouldn't trust Penelope." He says, quote, "Never tell a woman all you know." End quote. He also says, quote, "The day of faithful wives is gone forever." End quote. We can certainly understand where Agamemnon's coming from there, considering his wife was involved in him getting slaughtered and all of his men getting slaughtered as well. But this warning is going to be important because Odysseus is careful and strategic by nature anyway, but this is just another reason for him to be careful when he arrives back on Ithaca, because it is going to be dangerous. Ultimately, it turns out that Circe recommending that he go visit the prophet of death, Tiresias, and kind of make this visit to the underworld is not just important for Odysseus to learn about his mother and learn about his friend Agamemnon who died, but he's also doing himself a favor by speaking to the dead, learning their stories, and using that to help his own journey back home. Again, there is something here about the nature of death in this Homeric Greek world, because, again, it's simultaneously permanent yet impermanent. Death is a two-way street. Odysseus is asking his mom, "Hey, what did you see in the world before you died? And is there any information you can give me before I go home?" The mom is asking Odysseus what happened on his journey, and you have the dead and the undead putting the pieces together like a puzzle. Again, in this world, death is this thing that is part of this journey of life, and only in dying can you fully put together the puzzle. Another example of this is the shades or the ghosts that keep coming up to Odysseus. These people are supposed to be dead, but they're asking Odysseus all these questions about him. And they're asking questions about their own lives before they died and the people they knew. Hey, have you seen my son? What's up with him? How about my daughters? And so Odysseus is acting as almost this communication vessel between the worlds of the living and the world of the dead. Towards the end of Odysseus's visit here, it seems that the shades are starting to get a little anxious. They swarm around Odysseus, and ultimately he has to flee. So he goes back to Circe's island to give his friend that burial that he promised him. And this time he does all the proper rituals. And Circe also warns him of upcoming danger. So she outlines 3 very famous trials that Odysseus goes through here. The Sirens, who are these beautiful singers that lure sailors in with their wonderful songs, and sailors get so wrapped up in the song that they crash their boats on the rocks. Charybdis, who is basically a giant whirlpool, and Scylla, who is kind of hard to explain, but basically a giant monster. Circe gives Odysseus the lay of the land as far as these 3 villains go, and she also warns him, don't eat Helios's cattle once you arrive on an island where Helios owns some cattle. So, of course, we know that those cattle are getting eaten, if we know anything about the Odyssey, and what happens when you defy the will of the gods. But anyway, I think these trials are interesting because they connect to the idea of death, where Odysseus just explored this, and they also connect to this idea of evil in this Homeric world. What is evil in this world? And I think this particular book, Book 12, where Odysseus goes through all these things, the theme of evil is something that's interesting to think about. We just had a book where we talked all about death, and Odysseus had to grapple with it, and we can make some obvious connections between evil and death. From there, Odysseus has to bury his friend, and if we remember, Odysseus neglected that friend even in death earlier, and now he had to fix it. So perhaps evil can be neglect in some form. And I think it's intentional that that burial happens in this book, along with the Sirens and Charybdis and Scylla. And that brings us to the Sirens, who are really one of the most memorable and fascinating group of characters. And this sequence is one of the famous sequences in all of the history of storytelling. And it's interesting because the whole thing is literally like a paragraph. It's a couple of words. They sail past it and it's over. But it shows you the power of the Sirens and what they represent. And maybe I'll just read the whole section here that deals with the Sirens. For a little bit of context, Circe tells Odysseus that he and he alone, if he wants, can listen to the song of the Sirens that's so appealing to everybody. But he needs to tell his men, all of them have to put earwax in their ears to block the sound, and they also have to tie Odysseus down to the mast because he's going to try to convince all of them to untie him, and they're going to steer right into the Sirens and crash on the rocks and die horribly. So his men tie Odysseus down, and he's going to listen to the song of the Sirens as the rest of his men sail through. Here it is. Odysseus says, quote, "They bound my hands and feet straight upright at the mast. They sat and hit the sea with oars. We traveled fast, and when we were in earshot of the Sirens, They knew our ship was near and started singing. Odysseus, come here. You are well known from many stories. Glory of the Greeks. Now stop your ship and listen to our voices. All those who pass this way hear honeyed song poured from our mouths. The music brings them joy, and they go on their way with greater knowledge, since we know everything the Greeks and Trojans suffered in Troy, by God's will, and we know whatever happens anywhere on earth. Their song was so melodious. I longed to listen more. I told my men to free me. I scowled at them, but they kept rowing on. Eurylochus and Perimedes stood and tied me even tighter with more knots. But when we were well past them and I could no longer hear the singing of the sirens, I nodded to my men, and they removed the wax I had used to plug their ears and untied me." End quote. I think the sirens are a little bit misunderstood in popular culture. A lot of people view the sirens as these beautiful women who lure men in, and then this leads to the men's downfall. And to some extent, they might represent the lure of beauty and how that can lead to downfall. But I think if you look at the words of the song that the sirens are singing, it's also about the lure of nostalgia, and it's about the lure of a perfect knowledge of the past. So the sirens are telling Odysseus that they know everything that happened in the Trojan War, and they know everything that happened anywhere. And of course, they're glorifying Odysseus and saying how he's a war hero and did all these heroic things, and hey, we'll tell you more about that too. But this idea of a perfect knowledge of the past, the power of that temptation is huge. And what's interesting is that, of course, that's impossible. We know how memory works, and for someone mortal like Odysseus, that Song of the Sirens is just that. It's something that is tempting, but never actually practical or realistic or something that can actually happen in the real world. And sure enough, anyone who tries to get that perfect knowledge is going to end up shipwrecked. Even the pursuit of that end goal is impossible. Remember that we said perhaps Book 12 of the Odyssey is related to the idea of evil and what evil is in the Homeric world. And we talked about death, and we talked about neglect. And now with the sirens, we add in temptation, maybe, or maybe that striving for perfection or a perfect knowledge of the past that's not really possible. And once Odysseus makes it past the sirens, this brings us to Charybdis and Scylla. Odysseus and his men are literally between a rock and a hard place. They have to pass through this section of water where on one side you have Charybdis, which is this giant whirlpool that's going to suck everybody in and drown them. And on the other side, you have this giant rock where Scylla lives, who is this six-headed, horrible monster. But we'll start with Charybdis and what this whirlpool could represent. Circe points out that Charybdis traps in and sucks in unsuspecting sailors. So perhaps people who are a little bit in autopilot in life. And it might show the dangers and potential evils in sailing through life without a destination. But I also think it hints at a theme in the Odyssey which is important and which was introduced earlier in the story, but particularly in Book 11 with Odysseus' mom. And I think that theme is loneliness. Really, throughout the Odyssey, there is a loneliness here. I think part of that is just the geography of the story. There is something vast and empty and unknowable about the sea and the water. And the sea is everywhere in the Odyssey. But more than that, really, thus far in the story, all of the characters, or most of the main characters, Penelope is lonely, Telemachus is lonely, and Odysseus obviously has been wandering forever and is lonely. The characters are often surrounded by other people. Penelope surrounded by the suitors, Telemachus going to these other kings and being surrounded by their courts, Odysseus surrounded by his men, but they're almost never comfortable and they're never fulfilled. They're never where they want to be. There's an isolation here. And that isolation is part of what makes the Odyssey so intriguing. It's also a key feature of Odysseus's character, right? He is the wanderer. And as he's making all these journeys and doing all these things, he's doing it by himself, really. As he journeys deeper into the lore of the world, he's journeying deeper into himself. And again, he's coming to grips with the things that he's done and the decisions that he's made that have led him to where he is now. And maybe part of that introspection is what makes him such a compelling character, and also what makes him as a character so strategic and so calculating. Because he's so isolated, he has to think things through. At any rate, on the other side of Charybdis, the lonely whirlpool, is Scylla. And Scylla is hard to describe, so I'll let Circe do it for me. She tells Odysseus, quote, "That nightmare cannot die, being eternal evil itself, horror and pain and chaos. There is no fighting her, no power can fight her, all that avails is flight." End quote. So Odysseus has to choose, do I sail close to Charybdis, the whirlpool, or do I sail close to Scylla, the six-headed man-eating monster? He ultimately decides that losing a few men is better than losing all his men, so he steers towards Scylla, and he puts on his war armor as if he's going to fight this giant thing by himself. Circe tells him not to do that, and at any rate, he has 6 of his men end up getting killed. He's able to sail through, though, and they make it past the rock and a hard place situation. They're tired and they're starving. They wind up on Helios's island, and Odysseus falls asleep. Again, by the way, if you're keeping track, this is now the second time he's fallen asleep and his men have screwed up. But Eurylochus, one of his men, convinces the men to slaughter the cattle because they believe that famine is a horrible death and they're going to die anyway, so you might as well die from the wrath of a god. Bad idea. They eat all the cattle. Helios is really ticked, and Zeus destroys Odysseus' ship in order to basically protect the world from how mad Helios is. Everybody dies but Odysseus, and Odysseus is shipwrecked again, and he ends up at Calypso's island. So Odysseus' story has come full circle from Troy all the way to Calypso's island. And if we remember, he went from Calypso's island to the Phaeacians, and right now he's telling that story to the Phaeacian king, Alcinous. Now, as you're reading the Odyssey, it's hard not to wonder why these characters continue to go against the gods, even though every time they do it, terrible things happen. Well, it's worth noting that I think Homer puts some stuff in here to make sure that these men who kill Helios's cattle aren't seen as just idiots. They were desperate, and they were brought there to that point by starvation. So we said, what is evil during this chapter? Well, maybe it is desperation and starvation and famine and the lengths that men will go to when they're desperate. And even with all that, Helios lost his cattle. Sure, that's bad, but he didn't have to threaten the world with not bringing the sun up every morning. So maybe that's evil as well, these emotional retribution type of decisions. Rage. And then at the end of the story, Odysseus ends up with Calypso, where he's kind of lured into this sense of complacency, and he gets this taste of Elysium, this taste of godhood and immortality and perfection and sort of a life of ease. And again, we already talked about that part of things, but maybe that is some version of evil. So I think book 12 of the Odyssey is really interesting because it takes you all these different places and gives you all these different perspectives and theories on how bad things can happen. So like we said, the story has now come full circle, and we're back in the great hall of the Phaeacian palace where King Alcinous and his court are immediately impressed with the story that Odysseus has told, and they immediately offer to give him food and gifts and luxury, and most importantly for Odysseus, a ride home. How are they going to pay for this, you might ask? They're just going to tax the subjects of the kingdom to cover their losses. Must be nice to be a king. And so finally, after all of the wanderings, all of the adventures, all of the tragedy, Odysseus is finally going home. Homer describes this moment where Odysseus is on the ship, and again, after enduring so much, he's going home. Quote, "The seething waves of sounding purple sea rushed round the stern as she sped straight ahead. The swiftest bird, a hawk, could never overtake. She sailed so fast and cleaved the waves. She bore a man whose mind was like the gods, who had endured many heartbreaking losses and the pain of war and shipwreck. Now he slept in peace, and he remembered nothing of his pain." End quote. Odysseus finally makes it to Ithaca, but remember that Poseidon is still upset that Odysseus blinded his son Polyphemus, and he never got his revenge. So Zeus allows Poseidon to turn Alcinous's ship to stone. And it's worth noting because it's interesting that the Phaeacians actually get punished for extending guest right to Odysseus. Really, throughout the book in the Odyssey, usually guest right is seen as the thing that the heroes do in the story. And if you don't extend guest right to your guest, if you don't offer them a home for at least a few days, if you don't feed them and clothe them and bathe them, then you're seen as a villain. But in this case, the Phaeacians get punished for it. I think on the one hand, this indicates that Poseidon is a bit of a villain in this story, but it might also show that the will of the gods in this world trumps all, and defying fate or defying the divine world of gods, even for the right reasons, is dangerous. So perhaps Alcinous should have asked the gods if he's allowed to take Odysseus home before making that decision himself. Now, at this point, the rest of the story really takes place on Ithaca. Odysseus is back, and Athena meets him pretty much as soon as he washes up on shore. Classic Odysseus here. He spins this crazy story about where he came from and how he washed up here. Athena sees right through it, of course, and just says, "Calm down." She reveals herself, and she does a couple things. She, along with Odysseus, wants to make sure that he doesn't end up like Agamemnon, where Agamemnon came home and his wife wasn't loyal, and the suitors ended up killing Agamemnon. So first, him and Athena hide the treasure that he got from Alcinous, and they begin to plot how to take down the suitors. Athena needs to go get Telemachus back, because Telemachus is going to play an important role in Odysseus taking back his kingdom. Athena advises Odysseus to visit the swineherd, a guy by the name of Eumaeus, who is still loyal to him. And finally, Athena disguises Odysseus as an old man so that he can be in disguise and get the lay of the land. He needs to figure out who's loyal to him and who's not before he reveals himself. Homer says, quote, "Then with her wand Athena tapped him. His handsome body withered up, his limbs became arthritic. She bleached out his hair and made his skin look old and wrinkled, and dimmed his fine bright eyes. She turned his clothes into a tattered cloak and ragged tunic, dirty with soot. She wrapped around his shoulders a massive leather deerskin, and she gave him a threadbare satchel and a walking stick." End quote. There's something cool here about Odysseus, the master of lies, the cunning lord of deception, taking on one more disguise. And it shows that he really is the wanderer. He's been high, he's been low, he's been deceived, he's been the deceiver, he's made mistakes, and all of that is here now, and we're really getting into the end game of the Odyssey. Odysseus makes it to the hut of the swineherd, who, of course, immediately gives Odysseus hospitality and respects this man who looks like a beggar, a homeless man, even though he doesn't have to. And it turns out Eumaeus is still loyal to Odysseus. He's a bit upset at the suitors who are taking all of his pigs and hogs, and they're grossly violating guest right, stealing all of Odysseus's wealth and Telemachus' wealth. And this is making Eumaeus look bad because they're taking all of his pigs and they're not treating him with respect. It turns out that things in Ithaca really are that bad. The suitors are out of control. They're slaughtering all the animals. They're eating all the food. They're drinking all the wine. They're disrespectful. They're plotting to kill Telemachus. Penelope is trying to find Odysseus still. She's listening to anyone who will come off the shore on ships, and they're all spinning her these yarns, but none of the stories are true, and it seems like Penelope is slowly giving up hope. Now, Odysseus doesn't reveal himself to Eumaeus because he wants to test Eumaeus' loyalty. So Odysseus makes up this long, rambling story of who he is, and Eumaeus kind of nods along. And finally, Odysseus tells another long, rambling story, trying to manipulate Eumaeus into giving up one of his cloaks so that Odysseus can be warm sleeping at night. And Eumaeus basically chuckles it off and says, "No need to manipulate me," and just gives him the extra cloak. So we find out that Eumaeus is a loyal slave. We're going to talk more about the slaves and servants in Odysseus' household in further episodes, but it is interesting to note that Eumaeus has a lot of respect for Odysseus and Odysseus' father and mother, who bought him as a slave many years ago. Eumaeus now has a respected position, and it seems like he owns, if not other slaves, then at least servants that he commands. And so it's this example of how slavery in the ancient world is much different a entity than, say, the colonial world in the 1500s or the pre-modern world in the 17 or 1800s. Back to the story, Book 15 of the Odyssey is almost entirely just Eumaeus and Odysseus sitting around Eumaeus' hut and talking to each other. So they're chatting and talking about their parents and their past and how they ended up here. Two old guys discussing the scars of time. At one point, Eumaeus says, quote, "In later days, a man can find charm in old adversity, exile, and pain." End quote. It turns out that Eumaeus was abducted as a kid and sold into slavery. And during that time and throughout his life, he's had many hardships and trials and tribulations, but he really emphasizes that he's lived a good life, especially with the way that Odysseus' father treated him. Odysseus, for his part, says, "Hey, don't complain too much, because my life has been pain and suffering and tragedy too. And there's always going to be someone who has just as much or more trauma than you do. And I think there's multiple ways to read this scene and read this conversation between these two old characters who've known each other for a long time. Remember, Eumaeus doesn't know that Odysseus is Odysseus yet. Odysseus hasn't revealed himself. To Eumaeus, Odysseus just looks like an old homeless man. And Odysseus himself says that homelessness is the worst things that humans can suffer. So on the one hand, it's this moment where, again, the scars of time are catching up to these old men and they're reminiscing on their past life and they're thinking about grief and sorrow and sadness. And there is this weird way where after years, decades go by, you can look back at things that were horrible or that affected you terribly, and some of the sting is gone. And like Eumaeus says there, maybe you can find some measure of charm in overcoming that adversity, or at least living to tell the tale. But there's also another reading of this section, and it relates to this idea, again, of slavery in the ancient world. And we'll see this a few more times in the books that are coming up here in the Odyssey, but there's a number of times where slaves in the story take pride in being slaves and seem to enjoy their lives quite a bit, and they wouldn't trade it for anything, it seems like. So on the one hand, this shows loyalty, but on the other hand, maybe it shows the norms of ancient Greek society for Homer and maybe for the elite and at least the middle and upper classes who would have been the intended audience of a poem like the Odyssey. Maybe by making the slaves in the story seem to have good lives, this is a way to ramify the social structure of ancient Greece and ensure that slaves continue being slaves in the real world. So whatever your take on that, meanwhile, Athena goes to get Telemachus and she tells him, you need to come home right now. Telemachus, on his way home, takes in a random guy who is a refugee and actually a former killer, but he's fleeing oppression. And it's another example of Telemachus being kind and showing charity and extending hospitality to someone who maybe doesn't even deserve it. Telemachus makes it home. He enters Ithaca by stealth himself, and he ends up right at the swineherd's farm, right in time to meet his dad. At first, Telemachus meets Odysseus in a very kind way, but he doesn't recognize him. And why would he? He's been disguised by Athena, but also he's never met Odysseus. We have to remember that Telemachus was born after Odysseus left for the Trojan War. Telemachus, who is the master of Ithaca, tells Eumaeus, hey, go tell Penelope that I'm home, but do it in secret. This leaves Odysseus and Telemachus alone. Odysseus, still in disguise here, begins to question Telemachus, figure out what's going on, and even counsel him a little bit. So he urges Telemachus to find some allies, maybe the townspeople or maybe family. Odysseus says, quote, a man should feel his kin at least behind him in any clash when a real fight is coming, end quote. Telemachus, for his part, says, quote, if men could choose and have their choice in everything, we'd have my father home, end quote. We talked about this a few episodes ago, but this theme is going to emerge again where you have this messy mix of fate and choice where, as Telemachus highlights there, some things are choices and some things may be divined by the gods. After all, think about how much Athena has meddled in the story so far and guided Telemachus in pretty much everything he's done, and really the same thing with Odysseus. And sure enough, after a little bit of time, Athena shows herself to Odysseus and basically says, hey, stop being sly with your son. You need to reveal yourself. And finally, after so long, Odysseus meets Telemachus for real, and they both cry together and they embrace. Odysseus says, quote, I am that father whom your boyhood lacked and suffered pain for lack of. I am he. End quote. So atonement, redemption are themes here. Odysseus recognizing that him leaving for the Trojan War has left his son without a father, recognizing that the grief and pain his actions have caused have trickled out over the years. Odysseus also says, quote, it is no hard thing for the gods of heaven to glorify a man or bring him low. End quote. You're always just one moment away from rising high or sinking low. One choice or one chance from doom or glory. And so for Odysseus and Telemachus, they need to plan as best as they can because the odds and the fates might be stacked against them. So they put their heads together and they come up with a plan. First of all, Odysseus says, hey, we have Zeus and we have Athena on our side. Nice allies to have. Odysseus is going to be disguised as a beggar and he's going to go to the palace. Meanwhile, Telemachus is going to discreetly stow away all the weapons and the armor and any tools of war that could be used to fight, except for two sets, him and Odysseus. If the suitors question why Telemachus is taking all the weapons out of the house, he can say he's worried that they'll get drunk and fight each other. Very wisely, Odysseus says, quote, arms themselves can prompt a man to use them, end quote. In other words, sometimes just having a weapon around is reason enough to use it. The next phase of the plan is that both of them will discreetly try to figure out which of their servants and slaves, in particular the women, are still loyal to Odysseus. And from there, they'll figure it out from there. Meanwhile, the suitors realize that something's up. They hear news that Telemachus has returned. Their ambush didn't work. And Penelope gives a speech warning them not to touch Telemachus. And then the suitors, particularly Eurymachus, lie right to her face and say, hey, we have no intention of killing your son. But they imply that, hey, if the gods kill him, that's another story. So the suitors are now absolutely openly plotting to kill Telemachus. They seem to know that they're committing crimes here with the way they're treating Penelope, the way they're treating Odysseus' house. And part of the reason that they want to kill Telemachus at this point is avoiding retribution and avoiding punishment for their crimes. Antinous, one of the lead suitors, says this himself. Referring to Telemachus, he says, quote, we need to make plans to murder him. He must not get away. He will obstruct our courtship if he lives, since he is wise to us and he will plot, and now the people will be turned against us. Telemachus will gather them. He must be furious, and he will not postpone action. He will stand up and tell them how we plan to murder him, but fail to do so. When they hear of our crimes, they will condemn us. We may get hurt or driven from our land to foreign territories. We must stop it. End quote. And with that, the pieces of the end game are finally starting to be put together in the Odyssey. Odysseus is back on Ithaca. He has a plan to take on the suitors, or at least concepts of a plan. Telemachus has finally teamed up with his father. Penelope is at her wit's end trying to deal with the suitors, and the suitors are basically openly plotting murder. So all the pieces are in place, and that's where we will pick up next time. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe on Patreon for bonus episodes, video essays, behind-the-scenes content, and other perks. You can also join the Patreon for free to get a monthly recommendations email and a sneak peek at what's up next. You can support in other ways by subscribing and leaving a rating or review in your podcast app, by following on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, etc., by sharing with a friend, or simply by continuing to listen. You can also sign up for my email newsletter, which has some written pieces and podcast updates every now and then. Links to all of this stuff are in the show notes. Any comments or suggestions you can send to reflectinghistory@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. That's it for now.